First, let's go through a little bit more on the leaves idea. And I think we left off here where we were thinking about this idea of transpiration and the movement, which is the movement of water through the plant body. And the only way that that really can kick in is if the stomata are open. Otherwise, you don't get the appropriate force to allow for that movement. Do you remember what the force is? What kind of force is needed? A couple of different ways you can say it. Tension. What's the definition of tension? Tension equals negative pressure. Yep. So tension, negative pressure, and you're thinking about a gradient. So you have really strong tension in the leaf area, and then less tension as you move your way down towards the roots. And so if you have that gradient, you will get water movement. If you don't have that gradient of tension, you won't. And so we're thinking about the xylem. We're zooming into that, and we're thinking about water flowing through those hollow tracheas and vessels and moving through, once the water gets dumped into the xylem root tissue, and then it's all connected. And so as long as those water molecules stay connected through cohesive forces, water likes to stick to other water molecules. As long as you have that, you'll have that tension gradient felt all the way, originating in the leaves, as soon as the stomata open, all the way down. Okay, and so if you're a plant and you live a normal life with your roots in the soil and you're waiting for the sun to come up, as soon as the sun hits your body, you will be very quickly opening up your stomata because you want to start photosynthesis. And remember, the photosynthesis doesn't run during the night. Obviously, the light reactions don't run during the night, but neither do the dark reactions, which used to be called dark reactions, or light independent. But really, when you think about the Calvin cycle, and I talk more about this in Plant Phys, but in the Calvin cycle, there's key enzymes that actually need to be activated by light. And so plants around here, when the sun sets, not only do they stop doing the light reactions, they stop doing the Calvin cycle. And so, but of course, then when the sun hits their body in the morning, they got good to go and immediately take advantage of the sunlight and start doing both the light reactions and the biochemical reactions, the Calvin cycle. So, in words, thinking about water coming into the xylem, the tracheas and vessels. If you're an angiosperm, you have those lovely dissolved minerals in there, which I haven't talked quite yet about, but hopefully I can get that in at some point. And then we're thinking about a unidirectional flow. And so water is only going to move up the plant from the roots to the leaves. We don't see it doing the opposite. We don't see water flowing down through the xylem. So the stomata must be open for this to happen. And as soon as the stomata open, you get that evaporative action where the liquid water in the xylem, you have to imagine it oozing out of the leaf vein, and you get the spongy parenchyma cells primarily are coated with liquid water, and then it starts to evaporate into the airspace inside the leaf, and then it evaporates out. And all of that happening puts that tension force on the liquid water molecules. And so that tension gradient originates up in the leaf. And that took a lot of research. It took a lot of decades of research to figure out how this is happening. And it is actually, when you think about some of these massive trees that are super tall, the fact that you can get water movement through them is pretty impressive. And so you can say it's pulled up or sucked up through the plant, but that tension force originates. So the cohesion tension theory, thinking about water molecules that cohere to each other. So you have to have a solid column, so to speak, of connected water molecules all the way through the xylem, all the way down to the root tissue in order for it to have that successful tension force pulling it up. So again, we're zooming into the leaf for that. We're thinking about how as soon as the stomata opens, have all that kicking in parenchyma cells, and then it starts to evaporate into the gaseous phase. And so all of that starts to generate that tension force. So that idea of, as soon as the stomata open, you will have water exiting the leaf and water vapor. And then of course, the chaos is you also have CO2 entering. Now, when they do studies and they look at how much water is transpired through the plant body, it's ridiculously high percentage. It's like 95% of the water that's taken up gets transpired out, which seems kind of wasteful, but it serves a purpose, more than one actually. And so, yes, you know, think about when you sweat. If I make you go run a race, a 2-mile race, and then I stick you into a room with no wind and high humidity, that sweat's going to stay on, right? You're going to be kind of miserable. However, if I make you run the race, stick you in a room and put a fan on you, you're going to feel cooled off, right? And so think about that idea. The water vapor is heading out the leaf. It's kind of like them sweating in a way, in the sense that it does cool them down. And so transpiring is a cooling process. It can help with that. It can also, remember, with that water comes the minerals, right? And so getting that water into the plant body brings in the minerals. So that's another huge payoff. So all day long, they're getting their mineral supplements by doing this transpiration because the minerals are dissolved in the water in the soil. And so this boundary layer here that you see, this gray part on the surface of the leaf, that's like still air molecules. They're trying to talk about is any solid substance has a boundary layer. You have a boundary layer. We all have a boundary layer. We have still relatively still air molecules on our skin, and they have that too on their plant body, and there's no exception. And so think about it. If you stir up that boundary layer, you stir up those air molecules, it's going to help get water vapor out quicker. It's like you sweating, putting a fan on you versus no fan. Essentially, when you stand in front of a fan, your boundary layer is, and it's letting you sweat. You're sweating back. Same idea with transpiration. And so plants will transpire faster in some conditions. Windy conditions, they are going to transpire faster. And that, of course, can have an impact on if they're already kicking into a drought situation because there's not much water in the soil and it's a windy day, that can lead to a crisis situation where they have to go, you know what, I'm going to have to shut down my stomata because it's starting to get into a drought situation here that's not so good. And so they'll make the decision, so to speak, to shut down, even though it's sunny out. And so you can have plants needing to shut down stomata. And then, of course, their CO2 is not coming in. And so photosynthesis starts grinding to a halt. And so that it's, you know, they got to sit there and wait it out. Hopefully a rain event will come along. If it's your potted plant, hopefully you'll water your plant. So, you know, that transpiration rate can fluctuate through the day, depending on what's going on in their environment, how windy it might be, the boundary layer. But that transpiration does help with bringing in the minerals for sure, helps with cooling. And some say that, you know, they need to do more research on this, but some say that it might help release certain chemicals out, like toxins out of their body, but that's still kind of a big question mark right now. Although we know plants can certainly release all kinds of interesting chemicals through their stomata. All right, so is it in this one? Yeah. Oh. Here they're showing just trying to get across the visual of all the way down in the roots, how the water will get into the xylem and then start coursing up through the plant due to the force up in the leaves. So that's a pretty good visual. This one I wanted to point out as well. This is a nice summary too of the transpiration process. And one thing I wanted to point out here is, you know, I said that all the water in the xylem have to be connected to each other. All those water molecules, it's like a solid column of water. So in this middle image, you see an air bubble. And the fancy word for that is cavitation, which I've added. So cavitation can be analogous to an air embolism in somebody's veins. And if you know anything about that, that's not a good situation. Getting an air embolism in your veins can kill you. It doesn't kill the plant, but it's an analogous situation where you have an air gap where you're supposed to have flow. With us, it would be a flow of blood. With them, it's flow of water. And if an air bubble pops like that, the water molecules essentially can't keep going beyond that point in that particular vessel drawn. And so they're showing these arrows rerouting. What they're trying to show there is that when you cluster your vascular tissue like that, you can reroute your water flow successfully to nearby vessels and trachea. So that's why whenever you look at vascular bundles, it's a bunch of tracheas and vessels all clustered together, a bunch of phloem all clustered together. And so part of the reason for that is, well, if a vessel or trachea fails because of an air bubble, they can reroute, and it's not all doom and gloom. So you have to remember that when water is in the soil, it's not pure water, right? You've got minerals in there, but you also have gases in there. So the same gases that are above ground, they're in the underground too. There's CO2 and there's oxygen and there's nitrogen. All of that is in the ground, and it's dissolved in the water. Assuming there's some nice water in the soil, all those gases get dissolved in the water. Well, if you've taken a physics class where they give you a solution that has gases dissolved in it, and then you apply tension on that body of water, it can pop the bubbles out of solution. And that's essentially what you see happening. If the dissolved gases are put under too much tension, where the plant is really exerting a strong tension force, you can actually get the air or the gas bubbles coming out of solution. And then we say it's cavitation. All right. And so by the end of the growing season, you'll probably have a fair number of, especially vessels, because they're wider in diameter, so it's easier for things to pop, the gases to pop out of solution in a wider diameter. Tracheids, it's much more difficult. And so that's why when you see plants growing through the summer season, they put their tracheids down after spring, after hopefully the lovely spring rain. They can afford to put a bunch of vessels down. Once they start growing into summer, where it's more drought prone times, then they'll make tracheids, because cavitation doesn't occur as readily in a smaller diameter trachea compared to a bigger diameter. And so you can see that growth pattern in angiosperms when they have the option, should I put a tracheid or should I put a vessel? And a lot of it has to do with what they're sensing in the soil in terms of how much water do I have. And they'll base that decision on that. So if that air bubble, the gas bubble pops like that out of solution, there could be a way to solve that, get it back into solution. Can you think of what is, so I just said tension pulls the gas bubble out of solution, so to speak, pops it out of solution. So what might allow it to go back into solution? Pardon? Yeah, essentially release the tension, right? If you release the tension, kind of like a rubber band, which I don't have, but if you imagine, pulling on a rubber band, that's kind of like the water molecules. If you imagine the rubber band as the water molecules, you're putting that pulling tension force. And then if you close your stomata, you're relaxing the tension. And that helps get air bubbles back into solution. And so overnight, when they close their stomata, the tension force drops, then maybe you'll get some of those air bubbles back in. It's not a guarantee, but it does help. Okay, so solid column. Yes. Yep, because that, you're exactly right. The tension force is greater, like higher up on the tree trunk, for example. Yes. So here's another depiction, and this one they're putting together both ideas of water movement through the plant body, but as soon as you open the stomata, you also have CO2 intake in order to make sugar. And so the sugars are coated in green arrows, and those you see going down the plant. And so sugar transport, which we'll get into as well, that is occurring throughout the full body. It can go in any direction, but water flow is only unidirectional. Once it's dumped into the xylem and the roots, its only option is to go straight up to the leaves and out through the stomata, with bypasses on the way. There's some that, you have to imagine the water kind of trickling off where it's needed, of course. But the movement, you never see water flowing through the xylem. So here we're looking at a leaf under the microscope, and you can see here that there's the central vein here. That's one big vascular tissue there. And you can kind of see the xylem is kind of the reddish cells, and the phloem is near there, okay? And then you can see that there's the palisade area with the column-like parenchyma cells. And then there's the spongy parenchyma with lots of air gaps. Okay, so you have to imagine the liquid water clinging to the surface of those, especially the spongy parenchyma, and then evaporating off into the air spaces, and then eventually out through the stomata. So leaves, if you think about certain trees, for example, even bushes though, any kind of plant that has a very kind of voluminous or copious amount of leaves and branches, so I usually think about trees, they can actually design their leaves to be different depending on where their leaves are on their body. And so it's kind of neat to think that one tree can design different types of leaves, in the sense of, we usually see it most dramatically if you think about leaves that are like the very top of a tree canopy, like a beautiful maple tree. The leaves on the top that are getting full sun will look different than the trees that are mostly shaded. I'm sorry, the leaves that are mostly shaded out on that same tree. And so this is taken from one tree. I think this is actually maple, yeah. And the top leaf, these are cross sections of leaves. The top leaf is a sun leaf, so it's like one up high on the canopy of that maple tree. And you can see an obvious difference between the top image and the bottom image there. The bottom image are leaves that are mostly shaded. And you can see that there's difference in thickness, and that seems to play out. It's not just with maple trees, it seems to happen pretty consistently when you look at shade versus sun. So sun leaves tend to be thick in diameter, but smaller in surface area. So when you look down on the maple leaf, it'll be smaller in surface area compared to a leaf that's getting shaded. They are thinner, but bigger in surface area. And so you tend to see that pattern. So on one tree, you can get a slightly different design. And it's really noticeable when you take a cross section and look at it on the microscope like this. So often with sunny conditions, leaves will form, like sometimes they'll have multiple palisade layers instead of just one. And they're thicker because of that. And then the one on the bottom there, you can see they're not really showing the surface area difference, but you can clearly see that the thickness is varying. And then, of course, leaves can be in different orientations with respect to the ground. And so you might have leaves that are, in this case, leaves are hanging down. Kind of like if you think about a weeping willow, where you have leaves like that. And so they can be more vertical to the ground rather than growing horizontal to the ground. If you think of like the weeping willow in this area. Here's another depiction of a leaf in cross section. And you can actually tell a lot once you learn a few simple rules of why the leaf looks like this. And so here you're seeing what I like to do when I look at a cross section of a leaf and I'm trying to figure out, learn a little bit more about it. What I do is I mentally cut it in half in the image and I look what's below that line and what's above that line. And pretty much what you see above that line is pretty much what you see below that line. Wouldn't you agree? It's pretty symmetrical. And so when you look at that kind of leaf tends to be a leaf that spends its life more vertical to the ground rather than horizontal to the ground. It tends to be more vertical. And they often, if you look carefully, there's at least 2 layers of palisade. So a double palisade layer, that's another kind of clue that it's probably a vertical leaf. Then the other thing I look for is where does stomata? And sometimes, depending on the section, the microscope side, sometimes it's difficult. But let's look at this one. Here you can see, well, there's one obvious stomata on the top of this image, and then you see another one down low. So if you were to scan, you'd probably end up seeing on this microscope side pretty even amounts of stomata on the top portion of the prep and on the bottom. That's another giveaway that the leaf probably spends its life pretty much vertical to the ground if you have stomata on both sides of the prep like that. And so what that's saying is that as the sun comes up, it, it arcs across the sky, it sets. It doesn't really, if your leaves are more vertical, there's nowhere to really hide your stomata away from the sun. So they just put it kind of even on both sides. The other thing to look at here that tells a little bit more about this plant is you look at the vascular tissue. And I think most of you, if you looked and thought about it, you'd come up with, yeah, here's a vein cut in cross section. But this one too is also a vein. It's just that when they made the cut to make the slide, it's like they took when they made the cut, the vein is getting cut along its length. So when they sliced it, it's cut along the length. Whereas this vein is coming out directly at you. You cut it, then it's a cross section. So what this is saying is one vein is coming out at you, the other vein is going this way. So what is that, a monocut or dicot? Dicot. Veination patterns. And the parallel veins would mean a monocot. Netted veination, veins going in different directions, then you have a dicot. So just from that one image, you can actually, once you know a little bit of the rules of how plants design their leaves, you can get a feel for what you're really looking at here. Here's another image. So is this a monocot or a dicot? Yep, monocot. All the veins are in cross section coming out at you. And so parallel veins, so monocot. Again, if you cut the image in half mentally and then look what's above and what's below, if it's pretty similar, which it is. I mean, when you look at what's going on above versus what's going down below, it looks pretty similar. So again, this is a vertical leaf to the ground. Stomata here is a little more tricky to see. You have to span the whole section of the slide to get the count. Another thing to look at here to tell a little bit more, and it's more obvious here with the minor veins. Look how big those bundle sheath cells are. They're really plumped up around the vein. Really, really big. So what kind of plant, what kind of plant is famous for having really big bundle sheath cells? C4 plants. So just from looking at this, I can say with high confidence this is a C4 plant because of all of those really plump bundle sheath cells. So again, once you learn a little bit about some of the leaf design options, you can actually tell a fair bit about the plant. Here again, cut this leaf mentally in half, and you look above ground, above the cut and below. Again, it's pretty similar. What you see above the line is pretty similar to what you see below the line. So again, it's a vertical leaf that spends most of its time vertical to the ground. What do you think all this red stuff is? Yeah, the cuticle. Look how thick that is. That is really thick, waxy layer. So if you were a plant, why would you want to coat yourself in gobs of wax? Under what living environment would you be faced with? Really dry, really hot. Yep. And so it would make sense to really slather on the wax to try to really minimize any possibility of water exiting out through any cracks or crevices. Just really get a thick cuticle. And so again, you can tell that, well, this plant must be adapted to really dry, probably hot conditions that are pretty consistent in its environment. This is a leaf, believe it or not. It doesn't look like a leaf, but this is a really interesting adaptation. So here you see these invaginations like this in the leaf. So they actually refer to those stomatal crypt. Let me put it up here. Crypt, or crypts for plural, stomatal crypts. So why do they call it that? Well, you got to look. So if you, let me zoom in a little bit. Here's a zoomed in picture. So here, if you look on the very, very rightmost portion of the plant and just follow, like there's no stomata. There's nothing, they're not there. Right in this area, there's no stomatal, no guard cells, no pore, nothing. So if you start looking like, okay, where'd they put their stomata? You go up into these stomatal crypts and then you start seeing, oh, there's some stomata. Okay, they're tucked away in those invaginations into the leaf tissue. Here's another image of a similar plant with stomatal crypts, and they added an additional adaptation of putting a bunch of trichomes there in that airspace, in the crypt space. And they've tucked their stomata up there again. So now imagine this leaf in a wind tunnel with wind flowing over the leaf. So I told you earlier that if you put wind across your body or the leaf, it reduces that boundary layer and it would speed up transpiration. But since they don't have any stomata here, it really doesn't matter, right? If the wind rushes along that, the plant's like, yeah, it doesn't bother me. You're not increasing my transpiration rate with increasing wind. It's not happening. I've hidden away my stomata. The wind can't affect me. Exactly, right? So it's like, why would a plant decide to be that protective of its stomata against wind? And so here you need to think about what kind of environment might it live in where a windy day would be really seriously a crisis for the plant. What else could it be being exposed to on a regular basis where adding wind into the mix might just kill it? Drought, exactly. And so plants that are in really drought-prone, consistent drought-prone areas, that's bad enough. Adapting to that, dealing with getting enough water every day is bad enough. But then you stack on wind on top of it, where if they had all their stomata on the surface, that would just increase the transpiration rate probably way too much and end up killing them. No, not that. I don't think they've noted that kind of issue with the plant, but the trade-off though too is it's going to slow your transpiration, sure, but in this particular environment, it's definitely a payoff in a good way, because in these types of plants, you can find them in really drought-prone areas, windy areas, and they go ahead and tuck their stomata, and so that the wind can't mess with speeding up their transpiration. They want to keep it low because they're in drought-prone areas. So this is pretty drastic. It's pretty a neat little adaptation, and pretty marvelous that they evolve this mechanism in order to really tuck away their stomata away from the wind. And then here, adding the trichomes, that just keeps those still air molecules. So all the air molecules in those crypts are nice and still. The hair just makes them even more likely to stay still, because they're going to break up any wind that can come in there. And so that's a nice adaptation as well. This is a leaf too, believe it or not. And so this is a pine needle. And so here you can see that they don't have stomatal crypts, but we call them recessed stomata just a little bit. Okay, they're just a little bit recessed. And that does help windier environments where they might be a little bit of drought, not so drastic as what we were just looking at. And then the vascular tissue, you see they usually have two veins, and if you think about how narrow a pine needle is, they usually just have two vascular veins. And then eventually the deciduous plants around here, they're going to take their leaves off in fall. And so the way they do that is a natural process. It's programmed cell death, but it's in a very particular spot of the leaf petiole. So those veins draw the leaf blade. The leaf blade is out here on the top right, and then this is the petiole attached to the leaf blade, which is attached to the stem. And so here you're seeing the abscission zone forming. It's this line of cells that will weaken over time in the fall, and it's controlled heavily by hormone action. And it is kicks in. What happens is there's enzymes that will start acting on those cells in a line like that, so that they all weaken in that one layer there, and then it'll fall off the tree. But before they kick into that, they'll have siphoned away all the yummy nutrients that might be in the leaf. And that's one of the reasons why you see the color change. It's because they're siphoning away and storing up those nutrients before they kick into going through abscission. So it's actually this idea, ultimately the hormone that really kind of is the final straw in getting the abscission zone to form, it's ethylene. So the gaseous hormone ethylene, that's the one that really says, okay, enzymes, get going. You need to weaken this layer and have the leaves fall off. Okay. Here's an actual picture of an abscission zone of the leaf petiole. That's the stem. Yeah, forming quite nicely in a line. And so that's pretty efficient. Just have that narrow band go through abscission, and then the petiole will fall off. There's another one. The abscission is off to the left this time. The abscission is on that one. So pretty efficient mechanism. Here, they're trying to depict how when in the summertime you have plenty of hormones in the leaf, pretty much telling the plant, I'm healthy, I'm active, don't get rid of me. And so you tend to see leaves that have good amounts of cytokinin and auxins. That's all saying, I'm good, I'm growing, I'm doing my thing. And then what tends to happen is those hormone levels drop. So that's what I'm trying to show in the middle image. Anytime you put a line like that with a bar on the end like that, I'm saying it stopped. And so what they're saying is that flow of hormones down the petiole starts to decrease. And that's what actually picks up. That will then increase and tell that area, go ahead and go through excision. And you can see how the artist drew, dark green, healthy leaves, and then progressively less chlorophyll and other nutrients they're getting siphoned off. This is a leaf, believe it or not. So if you cut this leaf in half, does what's above look like what's below? No. Here you have a bunch of palisade cells up here. You don't have any of those down here. So this is telling me this leaf spends life more horizontal to under those visual cues or clues. The other thing I would look at here, look at the vascular tissue. It's kind of minimal. Like, you don't see a ton of tracheas and vessels there. There's a few. It's pretty minimal. What kind of plant might not really need to devote much energy to making tracheas, vessels? Water plants, right? So this is making me think this might be an aquatic plant because it's not devoting energy to water uptake, which probably means it's around water all the time, or maybe even totally submerged in water. Because remember, water is pretty darn precious to plants. So they are going to have vascular tissue if their roots are in the soil and they have to really work for that water. If they're buried in water, so to speak, submerged in water, I don't need to really devote energy to design. So I'm starting to think aquatic. All of this dead space, what do you think it's filled with? Well, if you had a toddler, would you just throw them out into the water and say, go for it? Or would you put something on them first? Yeah, it's just air. Yeah, like it's space for air, space for air. And so it's like putting on a PFD in a way, right? You're creating a situation where your body, in this case, it's in an internal PFD. The leaf is like, I'm going to create all these lovely air spaces in my leaf body, that part of my body. And what would that help you do then if you're in the water? You can float because this plant wants access to sun. So it's designed, I'm going to really be minimal on my xylem because I'm in the water, but I want to get close to the surface because I want that sun. And so they put those internal air gaps so you can fill that with air and just be able to float. And so we're thinking about not all aquatic plants will do that. Some are happy to be submerged all the way and they just deal with the light coming down into the water. But other plants, like lilies, for example, water lilies, they like to be floating to the top. So again, examining these pictures, these leaves under cross section can be quite informative. Okay, let me stop there. So that's the content for the exam. That slide set. We'll stop there. So that's the leaves 1 in EduCat. Leaves 2 we'll save for the next exam. And so I did want to ask if you had any questions on the, especially with photosynthesis. Let me pull up that slide set. So that's where you have the starting point for the exam content. Let me do this. Okay, so now we're looking at the slide set for photosynthesis. What kinds of questions do you have about any of the cycles or the light reactions? Yes. I think studying diagrams help, but I don't have them set up as diagrams in actual exam. So for some of this, I'm going to do drag and drop, where I'll ask you, like you'll have the word bank, and I'll ask you, to pick the right word for what I'm describing. And so if that helps sometimes, but I'm not going to have a but I sure think it helps learning it. I really advocate you draw it out. I used to like going into different classrooms where you could use the whiteboard and just draw things over and over and over and talk through it. I think that's a good strategy for a lot of physiology reactions. Other questions? Yes.
So, what is the name of the carbohydrate that's like the, I thought it was
So did I send an email or an announcement saying that I altered that question? Yeah. So I sent an announcement that usually goes right into your email as well. So to clarify that, because a couple students remarked that it was confusing, so I went in and what I was trying to get you to think about with that question, with CAM plan, which shows up here on this picture, when they are needing to open their stomata at night, bring in CO2, that means they need to have a carbohydrate, carbon-based molecule ready to go. And so they'll actually have a bunch of starch in their chloroplast that will break down and use to form the PEP, the phospholipid pyruvate. And so all night long, they tend to break down starch to allow for PEP production to be there for the CO2 coming in. And so that's what I was trying to get you to think about with C4. It's a little different. C4 plants do the cycle here, where once malic acid dumps the CO2 to Rubisco, other product is pyruvate or pyruvic acid, and that is used to make more PEP. So it's different depending on if it's a C4 or a CAM. Other questions on any of this content? Yes.
even though the parasite is made of cells, is still
The pericycle, yeah, it's considered meristematic. Yeah, and so it's right below the endodermis, and it's necessary because root systems are constantly growing. They constantly have to make lateral roots, and that's the pericycle's job, is to make lateral roots. Yeah, any questions? It doesn't have to be just this slide set. If you have any other questions. So what's the enzyme in the Calvin cycle? What's the enzyme that reacts or works with the CO2? What's the name of that enzyme? Rubisco. What's the 5-carbon sugar? RUBP. Please, please get that straight. Okay, that you need to know the difference. RUBP is the 5-carbon sugar. Rubisco, CO, that's the enzyme. What does the C stand for? I haven't heard it. Carboxylate. O for oxygenate. Okay, so Rubisco is that sloppy enzyme. It can either take in CO2 into its active site or oxygen. And that has a lot of ramifications and consequences. All right, so the exam is on Friday. Wednesday too, I'll ask if you have any lingering questions, okay? But the exam content stops with leaves 1. I'll see you on Wednesday.